Pretty much everything that NBC News and the New York Times have told you about the war in Ukraine is a lie. The Russian army is incompetent, they claim. Ukraine is a democracy. Vladimir Putin is Hitler and he's trying to take over the world. Thankfully, the Ukrainians are winning. None of that is true. Every claim is false, the last one especially. The Ukrainian army is not winning. In fact, it's losing badly. Ukraine is being destroyed. Its population is being slaughtered in lopsided battles with a technologically superior enemy, or scattered by the millions to the rest of the globe as refugees. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. As that happens, the question will inevitably arise, who's going to replace them? If the Ukrainians can't beat Putin, who will? The answer, of course, will be us. American troops will fight the Russian army in Eastern Europe. That's most likely. And the assumption is we'll win. But will we win? Probably not, says former Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran who advised the Secretary of Defense in the last administration. The U.S., says Macgregor, is on the brink of a catastrophic war that could very easily destroy us. Few Americans seem to understand that, but they should. Doug Macgregor is now the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, and we sat down with him recently. This conversation is worth hearing. Doug Macgregor, thanks for joining us. How would you assess and describe the state of the war in Ukraine right now?
That's an important question, and not enough people have good answers at this point. I think all of the lies that have been told for more than a year and a half about the Ukrainians are winning, the Ukrainian cause is just, the Russians are evil, the Russians are incompetent, all of that is collapsing. And it's collapsing because what's happening on the battlefield is horrific. The Ukrainians now, we think, have lost 400,000 men killed in battle. We were talking about 350,000 a few months ago. Within the last month of this supposed counteroffensive, which was to sweep the battlefield, they lost at least 40,000 killed. We don't even know how many people have been wounded, but we know that probably upwards of 40 to 50,000 soldiers are amputees. We know the hospitals are full. And we know that Ukrainian units at the platoon and company level, that's with anywhere from 50 to 150 to 200 men, are in piecemeal fashion surrendering to the Russians. Not because they don't want to fight, it's because they can't fight anymore. They have so many wounded, they can't evacuate them. And commanders are saying, well, if I can't evacuate my wounded, I'm going to surrender because otherwise the wounded will die. And so they call the Russians, and they all speak Russian, and tell them on the radio, look, I've got 50, 60 wounded here. I'm going to surrender because I don't want them to be killed. And the Russians from the very beginning have always treated the Ukrainian soldiers very fairly and very gently. And so they know they're not going to be abused or mistreated. They know they can actually be exchanged for Russian prisoners in the future. So they've surrendered. And I think we're going to see this army that we've been spending so heavily on increasingly melt away. And at the same time as we're talking, if you look at this long banana-shaped strip of territory in southern Ukraine that the Russians control, if you go to the northeastern corner of that, south of this city called Kharkiv, there are major offensive operations taking place there right now. And the Ukrainian forces are being swept away in front of the Russians. And again, all of this happens in a way that is just not reported in the West. And in the meantime, rather than admit that this is a terrible tragedy that should be ended on humanitarian grounds, if no other, that the killing should stop, as President Trump said, stop the killing, we're going to continue. And this puts the Russians in the unhappy position of marching further west, because from the very beginning, Putin and his advisors were never interested in a war with NATO or the United States. That's why you've had such incrementalism, this slow grind of movement forward, defensive operations for a long period to build up the force, and then continued offensive operations. They have over 300,000 combat troops in reserve in Russia. And I think they're sitting there and not being released to fight because President Putin anticipates the possibility that we will intervene in Western Ukraine. And if we intervene in Western Ukraine, the Russians will be ready for that. And the consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating because we are not ready to fight the Russians.
Why?
Oh, I think the readiness has been on the decline for a long time. You've had an almost steady, uninterrupted decline in the discipline that makes soldiers fight. Discipline is a tough thing. We don't always understand it. Discipline is really a form of habit, and you build those habits over time through repetition, but you also build it under stress, under pressure, so that it sinks in. And then you build cohesion within the framework of those units. You don't build cohesion when you're dividing the force on racial grounds, when you're pushing people who are clearly unqualified up the ranks to command, when you're rewarding people for anything other than demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence. All of those things are demoralizing, destructive to military establishments. The Army and the Marines are suffering with it, so is the Air Force and the Navy. And there's no easy fix. And these cracks that are just cracks at the moment will become giant fissures if you go to war.
So you spent the bulk of your adult life as an Army officer, went to West Point, commanded troops in battle. You're a combat veteran, decorated. But you entered the Army right at the tail end of Vietnam.
That's right.
When it was famously at its nadir.
Yes.
How would you compare the readiness of the current U.S. Armed Forces to, say, 1975 at the end of Vietnam?
I think that in terms of morale and discipline, we are close to where we were in the late 70s. We have a lot of people that are confused about what needs to be done. We've lost a sense of what's right. In other words, you don't have people that have served long enough in formations to know what right looks like, so that you can see a battle group, whether it's a battalion size or brigade or larger, and you know what makes things work. You know what it takes to fight in battle. We don't have very many people like that because since 2001, most of the fighting has been on a very small scale against a fleeting enemy. You know, running around in sandals with an AK-47, relying heavily on explosives, mines, to kill and maim Americans. About 87% of our losses were really a result of explosives that came from mines. This is not an army that is accustomed to fighting anybody who can fight back. If I were going to compare it to an army, a better comparison would probably be the French army before the Franco-Prussian War, because the French had fought Mexican bandits, Mexican rebels. They'd fought Arab bandits, Arab insurgents. They'd had a little experience fighting disgruntled, demoralized European troops, Austrians in northern Italy, but they hadn't faced a truly modern enemy. But people were convinced that the French army was the greatest army in the world because they'd fought in North Africa, in Indochina, Mexico, all over the world. That war was a catastrophe for France, and that army was decimated in months by a Prussian army that was a modern force, highly disciplined, very competently led, trained, and equipped. So we're not there. We have equipment that is decades old. The tanks that I served on, for instance, when I went to war in 1990, were virtually brand new, state-of-the-art. Those tanks are still out there. They've been rebuilt, but they're not new anymore. They're no longer as capable as they once were. You know, I'll give you a quick example. We have a turbine engine in the M1, A1 series tanks, and that turbine engine burns up as much fuel sitting still as it does moving, because it's a turbine engine. It was designed to be used on an aircraft. We put them into tanks. So that means you've got an 8-hour tank. Every 8 hours, if you're operating, you've got to refuel this thing. This thing also burns fuel at a very, very high temperature, over 1,000 degrees. And there are 40 plus connections around the engine that are very brittle, that can easily cause fires if accidentally they touch these little tubes that carry various types of fluid, if they actually touch this engine that's burning so hot. So the engine is so hot that you can track the movement of U.S. Army ground forces with tanks from low Earth orbiting satellites. So if you think you're going to hide or conceal yourself or outpace somebody, you're just a glowing target from space. To this must be added the ridiculousness of not having replaced that engine with a reliable state-of-the-art diesel electric engine, which is much cooler, which can go for 24 hours or more without a refuel. And these things are extremely problematic when you go to war, because you have to pull forces back, refuel them, return them to the front. That's not easy to do when you're operating as frequently as every 8 or 6 or 9 hours. They say, well, we put I guess, a generator on there to make up for this when you're sitting still. The problem is that you don't sit still for very long in combat, because if you do, you're going to be targeted and destroyed. And that, of course, is what we're seeing in Ukraine. Persistent surveillance from space, from overhead surveillance, makes everything visible all the time. So if you're going to embed yourself in the ground, if you're going to set up a permanent position there where you try to fire from that, you're going to be targeted and destroyed very, very quickly. So that's why this defense right now looks a lot like World War I, because anybody who moves is identified and killed. The only limitation on your ability to target and destroy the enemy is ammunition. The Russians, of course, have no shortages whatsoever. You recall at the beginning of this, we have all these shortages, right? The Russians can't keep up with missiles. The Russians can't keep up with shells. Well, they have multiple manufacturing facilities operating 7 days a week at 24 hours a day. We have no surge capacity in the United States. It would take us many, many months to come up to that kind of standard where we could actually compete in high-end conventional warfare. And that's why people like me and others worry that if we get into a confrontation, that we cannot win, because the world has changed, warfare has changed, integrated air defenses will knock virtually everything that flies out of the sky, that we will then fall back on a nuclear deterrent, a tactical nuclear weapon that says, if you keep advancing, we'll have to use a nuclear weapon. We don't want to go there, because the notion that there are so-called tactical nukes, you've heard that expression?
Yes.
Oh, that's just a little nuke, so that won't precipitate a major war. The use of any nuclear weapon is going to precipitate escalation very rapidly, because your opponents will assume that if they don't use their nuclear weapons, they're going to lose them. So we're living in a terrible dilemma right now. The smartest thing that we can do is end this war.